Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So welcome to Islamophobia Awareness Month is what that stands for. So I'm Halima and I'm a volunteer for Islamophobia Awareness Month. And this month, November, is one which we commemorate this day, which basically I'll go into more detail about what I Am is. So what is I Am? I Am is a month in which we celebrate Muslims, in short. That's what it's about. Even though we've got the word Islamophobia in it, because I personally believe that as a Muslim, growing up in the Western world, one way or another, I believe that we all have experienced Islamophobia. So we can't talk about all the goodness and all the achievements that us as Muslims have achieved within society in a Western world where there are boundaries and adversities and barriers for us to achieve our best without talking about those barriers that stop us from achieving our best, which is what essentially Islamophobia is. It goes much deeper than than physical attacks. It goes much deeper than overt hatred. It's more covert, and this is what I'm going to briefly go into. So essentially the month is about celebrating Muslims, but as well as talking about how we can recognize Islamophobia. So I've mentioned Islamophobia a lot of times, but just to run through the theme of this year, it's Muslim stories. So every year, Islamophobia Awareness Month, the campaign, we launch a campaign in November and we give it a theme. And this year's theme is Muslim stories. So it's about hearing people's personal stories. Because as much as we mention Islamophobia and we think of hate crime, but actually underneath that, it's people with real lived experiences. So whether that is positive stories, whether we want to hear from what women and men in society that are Muslims, British Muslims, do and have achieved, but there's also those other stories as well that are less, happy. But essentially, that's what that theme is about today. So, what is Islamophobia? It's Islamophobia. I want to. There's two types of definition, and we haven't actually come to a conclusion. I would say a togetherness of what it actually is in definition. So this is what we're also working to tackle. But there is two definitions that have been sort of outlined, and I'll go into that in just shortly. But first and foremost, because before the definition comes, we actually feel it more than anything. So although it hasn't been universally discussed about what it should stand for and what it is in definition, we know that we feel Islamophobia, and many people do. And so this is what I'm going to talk about. As I mentioned, Islamophobia is not just overt, something that you see, attacks, where someone is wearing a hijab being attacked outside, someone is being physically abused. It's much more discreet than that. And this is a little demonstration of what we feel Islamophobia is like. So this is what people see. And actually it goes much deeper down, and this is what actually it involves. It involves discrimination, whether that is open or in much more discreet. Stereotyping, someone might not necessarily be a Muslim, someone might just be wearing a covering. We see different minority groups such as African groups that wear the head covering, even Jewish people wear the head covering, but because it's perceived as Muslimness, some people might take that and make an assumption that they are actually Muslim. And that also is defined as Islamophobia. So now we know that Islamophobia doesn't just tackle just Muslims, but also it affects non-Muslims as well in society. Also exclusion. So many people, and I think the best example of that is particularly in schools. We see there's figures as well that come with this, that the Home Office have disclosed where bullying takes place in the school playground, and one of the words that come up between these incidences is terrorist or bomb, and those are the key words that big organisations as well as the Home Office have really described that come up in bullying, and that is directly related back to Muslims, because which child on the playground will likely be called that name? it's a child of color, you know, whether they're brown or maybe a small child that's wearing a hijab. So that's that. And then there's also marginalization. So we know that in society, you know, how often do we see a member of parliament that's wearing a hijab? Not so often. So essentially that's what marginalization is the barriers that prevent British Muslims from getting into certain sectors and certain spaces. And overall, that's what we feel and that's what we define as Islamophobia. So even though it's not being exclusively defined by amongst us Muslims, we have all, one way or another, experienced either verbal attack, physical attack, or these forms of discrimination. And then I would like to get into the definition. So as I mentioned, there's two types. So it's one that has been defined by the APPG of British Muslims, which is an all-party parliamentary group. And that's a mixture of different parties, so it's Labour Party, Conservative, SNP. And they've all concluded that this is what it stands for, Islamophobia, which is Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets the expression of Muslimness. So instead of a type of discrimination that targets Muslim, it mentions this word called Muslimness. You might have heard of it, but then you might have not. So what essentially that means is that anyone that can be seen, expressively be seen, or be mistaken as Muslim. So that's one of the definitions. And then another one which goes even further in definition is one that was released by Fear Inc., which is an American journal. So all of these are very well supported in evidence. They're evidence-based definitions. And this one says an exaggerated, irrational fear, hatred, hostility towards Islam and Muslims, perpetuated by negative stereotypes resulting in bias and discrimination. And essentially that talks about all the things that we talked about. So it's not just a physical attack of what defines Islamophobia. It goes much deeper than that. It's the hatred, it's the stereotyping, discrimination, overt, covert discrimination. And I guess this is a question just to kind of wrap up about, you know, what I've gone through just now. And I wanted to pose this back to the audience. I wanted to pose this back to you. So what proportion of the UK do you think is Muslim? Because we hear a lot of stereotypes about, and this is where it comes from, right? It's embedded in, you know, I think we've all heard that saying of, there's too many Muslims in this country. You know, I mean, we've all heard of it, in openness. And so I want to pose this question because this really fascinates people, what the actual numbers say, because this is what we should really be looking at. We shouldn't be looking at what others are saying, what the stereotypes are saying, you know, because they're based on discrimination, they're based on marginalization. So let's look at the numbers, because the numbers tell us the reality. So I want to pose this up. So what percentage of Muslims do we think are in London? Let's start off with London. Yeah.
Guessing 9%.
Okay. Well, so there's 35% in London.
Oh.
Yeah.
So a huge amount of people.
Yeah. And then West Midlands.
Was the 20%?
20% maybe?
20?
40%.
Okay. And now let's look at the Northwest.
Oh, interesting.
40% in the Northwest.
So they're very concentrated areas, basically. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
So let's look at Wales.
46% in Wales.
There's more and more concerts on.
And in Scotland.
48%. Wow, that's a lot as well.
It's amazing.
Okay. So you're all quite shocked. So I'm going to share now the next screen. So
Okay.
because how I worded the question, this is the part that's going to be eye-opening. So what that one was what people think. So that slide actually evidently shows what people's perceptions are.
Oh, I see.
So you can imagine where this opinion of there's too many Muslims, because that backslide here, this is the percentage. People think there's 35% Muslims in London. So you can imagine why they think there's too many Muslims.
Yeah.
But in reality,
12%.
I was close.
yeah, you're close, yeah. In reality, this is the reality.
Okay, it's not.
So
Western's only 6%.
Yeah. So you can see.
Northwest is only 5%. Yeah, that makes sense.
So you can see the drastic difference,
Wow.
particularly in Scotland and Wales. People think there are 46%. People in Wales think there's 46% Muslims, but in fact there's less than 2% Muslims in Wales.
Wow.
In Wales, 2%.
2%, yeah.
Less than 2% in Wales. But people think, Welsh people think there are 46% Muslims in Wales.
Wow.
So you can understand where this expression of them thinking that there's too many Muslims in the country, when reality, this is the reality.
That's true.
So this is what we're dealing with. This just shows that people have stereotypes and people have perceived connotations. And in the next slides, I'm going to roughly just tell you just some of the reasons why this is happening. Just a few reasons. We think at IAM, we think that there's 3 reasons. There's many others, but we believe that there's 3 core reasons. So I just want to read this out first. In the year ending March 2022, they were that many, 155,000 approximately, hate crimes recorded by the police in England and Wales, 26% increase compared to the previous year. And this was a statistic from 2002. So we do have an update on this statistic. So this is what it looks like. These were the amount of racially motivated hate crimes towards Muslims. So that's a third. And that is just one religion in comparison to all the other religions that exist in society in the UK. So a third of that makes up Muslims. So the fact that this, Islamophobia has not been adopted by our government just shows that it gives people the right to do it in a way. It encourages hate towards all members of society, whatever religion, whatever race.
And it's more women because we are
Visible, exactly, yes. So the latest statistics as well is increasing. So recently, 2023, the Home Office have released their latest statistics, and it's 39% of more hate crime towards Muslim in the UK in comparison to all the other religions. So that's 39%. That is Islamophobia. And that's what these are the statistics. This is what the evidence base, like this is what it shows us. And now, as I mentioned, going into the 3 main things that we think in IAM, what basically encounters for this to happen, to take place, what are the causes. So the first and foremost, which everybody probably are aware of, particularly in the rise of things right now, is the negative narratives in the media. The media is a very powerful institution, particularly in the West, and how we see it and how we perceive it affects us a lot more than we know. It affects people's behavior, it affects people's thoughts and perceptions. And so in the media, if we have these false narratives about Muslims, then what can you expect? The society, what can you expect citizens' opinions will be towards that certain group, So that's one thing. For example, we've seen, and this is just an example, this is a bit of a positive and negative. So obviously we talked about the negativity of like how media can affect people's mind and people's opinion towards a certain group. But likewise, it can also be positive. So as we've seen, like there's different influential people that are on the rise right now, and this particular football player, he's quite famous, Mohamed Salah, and a lot of young people look up to him. And so in the past year, on his rise of, I would say between the last 2 years, on his rise to like fame within the industry, there's been a more acceptance towards football, particularly in that particular football team. So is it Liverpool, I believe? Yeah, Liverpool he plays for. So there's been a positive, and we've seen that even now during what's going on in the Middle East. There's been very positive towards the fans themselves in Liverpool in support of civilians in the Middle East. So we can see also how media and also like influences like this really play a part. So it just goes to show that if we do tackle negative media narratives, we can tackle perceptions of people and acceptance of all kind of people in society. So that just goes to further show that media really does control a lot of narratives and a lot of people's behaviours. Another reason as to why we think is a cause is the lack of legislative support of Islamophobia. Does anyone know what you can do if you get targeted? Like if you, however way you might be targeted, let's say you were in a situation and you felt targeted as a Muslim because based on your religion, do you know what you can do like legally?
Citizen advice board.
Yeah, that could be one. Yeah, definitely.
Refer to your MP.
Yeah, definitely. There's different ways, and there's
legislation at work. I'm not sure in this country.
Is it the Race Equality Act? Would that come into?
Yeah.
play?
So this is the Racial and Religious Hatred Act. So it is. Yeah. So that's what I'm going to discuss here. There are different ways that you can report it. So like you mentioned, citizens' advice and through work. But really and truly, there's only so much they can get to that, and it all comes down to this act. Because this is the only act in the UK that criminalises people based on racial and religious hatred.
And it's recognized at work.
Yeah,
And at
but this
school?
is yeah
School as well.
anywhere in society. So this act is based on anywhere. So whenever there's an attack or an abuse towards racial or religious hatred, this act comes into place. But this is where the problem is. This is why there's a cause in Islamophobia, because if we look at race and we look at religion, they're both protected characteristics in the UN protected characteristics. Both race and religion, they're protected characteristics. However, in this act, which is a legislation, British legislation, only one is protected and one is not. The only way that you can get prosecuted, as you can see, if you get insulted, racially insulted, the institution, whether it's at university, in school, in education, at work, you can get criminalised. If there's an abuse, whether it's verbal abuse or physical abuse, you can report it and they will be criminalised. Same wise with violence threats, they can be criminalised. And intention to stir racial religious hatred, they can be criminalised. But in religion, even though it's a protected characteristics as well, if you get an insult and it's based on religion hatred, then you will not. There's nothing there they can do, so they will get away with it. Same, likewise with abuse, they can get away with it. Threats, violence, they can get away with it. The only way to criminalize religious hatred is through intention. And how do we measure intention?
Exactly.
How do we know? How do we prove intent? We
because
know.
it's always behind back.
Exactly.
It's a chatter in the staff room
Yes.
and stuff like this.
Exactly. So it's almost impossible, right, to prove intent. Lawyers can agree to that. So
Unfortunately.
yeah, and that just goes to show that there isn't enough support within our structural system, democratic system, to actually tackle. And this is not just affecting of Islamophobia, hate crime. This can affect anyone from any religion. Whether it's someone coming from a background of Sikhism, Hinduism, any religion, it's not protected under our law in the UK. And that just propagates these acts of violence even more. And then, I think we've covered this, I'll just skip past that. Yeah, and then I guess the last thing to mention, so I mentioned too, so it's legislative, there's not a lack of legislative support. Media narrative, false media narratives.
Thank you so much, my darling. That was brilliant.